We made this.
Welcome back everyone to a podcast all about the sounds of cinema and discussion about them between the notes, which is where we come in. I'm Tony Black.
And I'm Sean Wilson.
And this week, after the sad news of Ennio Morricone's passing at the age of 91, we're bringing you a celebration of the work of arguably one of the greatest film composers in cinematic history. And this was a slight change from our plan this week, Sean. We were originally going to record for the coming week an episode all about high school movies and, you know, to celebrate the students breaking up, if they are sort of breaking up this year and how it's all working. But then we had the sad news about Ennio Morricone's passing out of nowhere. And it just seemed right, I think, for us to change our plan a little bit and talk about a composer that we featured not, you know, just recently, but briefly. We talked about Once Upon a Time in the West in our last episode and has featured before in our discussions. And he's such a titan of the film music world. We had to sort of pay tribute to one of the absolute masters of this form.
Yeah, I think put simply, Ennio Morricone was one of the greatest artists the world has ever known in any medium, you know, be it painting, music, cinema, books. He was astonishing, and certainly if you think of him in terms of film music, I mean, he's up there with Bach, Beethoven, Mahler, Brahms, and I don't say that lightly. His extraordinary talent and the astonishing output that he maintained right up until his death was really, really, really something. And I don't think there's a film fan on earth who won't have been influenced by Ennio Morricone in one form or another. He was one of those rare artists his work crossed boundaries. And although film music is often accused of being quite niche, even by classical purists often look down on film music, Morricone's abilities were so extraordinary that he could cross that niche boundary, and he could reach out to people who wouldn't otherwise be interested in this medium. And certainly if you think of the theme for the good, the bad and the ugly, for instance, you know, one need not be a fan of film music to know what that is within a few bars of it starting. That's it's a titanic talent.
He really was. I'm going to say is. He really was. And we've chosen 10 tracks that we've, 5 each, and we've sort of picked from various different things. I mean, Morricone's career was vast, covering a massive range of time and, you know, all kinds of different albums and all for all kinds of different people from different countries. You would need an entire series of podcasts to discuss everything that he ever did. So we've whittled down to what we would say is 5 of our favourite tracks, not necessarily albums, but tracks that we're going to discuss one by one as we go on. But before we do, why don't we just give a bit of context to the man and his career, Sean? I mean, he's, like we say, he goes back 50, 60 years. You know, he was 91 when he died. He has such a span of work. And I suppose for people who aren't sure, where did it all begin? And I suppose the key sort of starting point for many people's minds would be the Sergio Leone Western trilogy, but there is more to his backstory than just those.
Yeah, there is. And in Morricone's own words, he was an experimental musician who happened to break into films. That's how he described himself. And he did have, I mean, his autobiography is incredibly complex and nuanced and multifaceted, as complex and nuanced and multifaceted as the scores that he would go on to write. But yeah, born in Rome, showed a prodigious talent for composition from a young age. Was encouraged by his father to read music. He entered the National Academy of St. Cecilia. He was tutored under Goffredo Petrazzi, to whom he would later dedicate concert pieces. So clearly, this was this was kind of an ingrained ability from a very, very young age, from when he was a boy, and then he then started to compose various pieces. He broke into radio dramas. He became established as a jazz artist. I think that's really, really important. By the rhythms of jazz, that kind of improvisational, slightly off kilter, slightly quirky feel is very, very important, because that is what was going to inform the tone, particularly of the spaghetti western scores, which he then ultimately broke into with his old school friend Sergio Leone. They'd been to school together, they were simpatico with each other, and it's really remarkable how a director and a composer clearly was singing off the same hymn sheet. You don't get examples in cinema of how things are so perfectly aligned as they were in the Dollars trilogy, because you have Sergio Leone thought operatically with the visuals, and Morricone absolutely got that through the music. But the interesting thing is, I mean, because of budgetary constraints, obviously the Dollars trilogy was made for, each of those movies was made for very, very little money, because one would think that obviously Clint Eastwood wasn't a big movie star by that point. He'd done like Rawhide, but clearly Clint Eastwood wasn't in a position to demand a huge amount of money, so they were made for low costs, which meant that Morricone had to draw on all of that prior experience in jazz. He had to draw on that instinctive compositional skill that he'd had since he was a young child in order to get around the budgetary constraints, and hence what you got in A Fistful of Dollars, and then later For a Few Dollars More in The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, was a really groundbreaking mixture of sounds that had not been heard in the genre before. One has to think that up until the 1960s, the genre was dominated probably by the sounds of like Alfred Newman, Max Steiner, Jerome Ross, Elmer Bernstein with the Magnificent Seven. Then Morricone came along and threw in guitars, jaw harp, grunting male choir, mariachi trumpet, threw all these disparate elements together. Again, in that obviously in the way that jazz had taught him, that to almost a kind of improvised sound. Although obviously as you hear it, it's obviously very, very well considered. But the idea of throwing all these disparate elements together clearly is very unpredictable. No one could have known it would have worked as well as it did. And history was made. And that is where, Morricone was thence propelled to become one of the greatest musicians of all time. It's remarkable.
I mean, that's a really nice summary, and it just shows the influence he had, and the reach he had as a composer, as somebody who came in with all these established musical styles. And we've talked about this before, haven't we? But this is something you often find with the truly great composers, isn't it? They have groundings in other areas before they come into actually scoring films. And I think that's why you don't get many who are quite at Morricone's level, I would say. I mean, you've compared him to some of the great classical masters in history, music history, not just beyond film history. But I think we're going to find, aren't we, as more and more of the Morricones and the John Williams and these guys, after Jerry Goldsmith, who we've talked about before, Basil Polidorus, after these guys die, we're going to find, I think, more and more as we go into the 21st century that film composers of this level are considered alongside the great masters of classical music. Because, in the past, it may not have been so, mightn't it? It might have been more that they are considered, film composers are considered something a little bit more disposable. But I think that culture has absolutely changed now. And, when you get the reaction to, Morricone's death, which is all over the internet, there was a hell of a lot of responses straight away of real sadness from all quarters. People who may not have necessarily known a lot about him, but knew aspects of his music. In fact, there was a lot of ire thrown at the Washington Post, wasn't there, for their tweet? I don't know if you saw this about.
I did, yeah.
They said Ennio Morricone, composer of the Wah-ya-ya music, dead, and everyone was like, "What? Like, are you serious? Like that? This that's so throwaway. That's not. Yes, okay." Everybody knows that tune from The Good and Bad, the Ugly, but it's not the sum of a man. There is far more to this man than just one thing, and I think that's it, isn't it? The passing of someone like Morricone continues that progress for film composing, and this as a truly recognised medium alongside some of the great classical opera, all that kind of stuff through history.
Well, he was one of a kind. Morricone single-handedly advanced the language of music, not just film music, but the language of music. Full stop. That is how much of a titan he was. And yeah, to go back to that Washington Post tweet, yeah, not only was it trite and somewhat tasteless, it's also very, very reductionist as well, because it implies that all Morricone was famous for was the theme for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. And Morricone famously it was famously a bit of a tetchy character from what I've read, and there's a brilliant tribute from Hans Zimmer online which you can see, in which he does describe Morricone as a brilliant man but a bit of a hard taskmaster. The western side of Morricone occupied, I believe, no more than 30 to 40 scores in a career that spanned over 400 of them. Some sources say that it reaches 500, which is just a jaw-dropping amount of work. He was remarkably prolific, even right up until his twilight years. And it's not right to describe him as the spaghetti western composer, because those scores occupied at best a tenth of his overall career. They are astonishing scores, and they rewrote the language of music in cinema. Of course they did. And there are probably within that spaghetti western canon, there are probably countless ones I haven't even heard of. In preparation for this podcast, I listened to a couple that I hadn't heard before, and I was like, blimey, this is just his ability to reinvent himself without necessarily repeating himself was really extraordinary. I was talking to the Empire critic and journalist Amon Warman, who's a friend of this podcast. We've had him on the podcast before, and hopefully we'll get him on again, where he said that it's very, very rare for a composer to be so identifiable within a few bars of music and yet to have that composer not repeat themselves. So you would know that it was a Morricone score literally within a few seconds of it starting. And yet he wasn't, for example, a James Horner. Morricone wasn't in the habit of lifting entire passages from his own work or from other people's works and dropping them in. Not that I want to rag on James Horner, because he is one of my favourite film composers, but Morricone didn't do that. I mean, there are tonal similarities between Morricone's scores. Variously elegiac, dissonant, tense, soaring, sweeping, whatever. There are tonal similarities between his works, but he never ever copied himself. Certainly not in the scores that I've heard, anyway. And that's another remarkable talent. I think Morricone always pushed himself, as Zimmer said. You know, he was very, very, very focused, very driven. I mean, clearly anybody who sort of broke into music as early as Morricone did and was developing various concert pieces and orchestral pieces at a young age, clearly it was a prodigious talent that was kind of inherent within him at a very early age, and cinema was the ideal output for that.
Yeah, it all came together at the right time, didn't it, for, you know, some amazing music going through absolute decades to come. So let's talk about our 10 then, because as I say, we've picked these 10 tracks that hopefully reflect a fairly wide selection of his work from various different sources and decades and things like that. And I think a measure of recognisable tracks from some albums, and also ones that perhaps people may not be as familiar with. And I think we did a Morricone episode a couple of years ago, Sean, on our previous incarnation of this show, and I think we talked about one or two of these back then, but those episodes are lost to the ages now. So I know for a fact there are tracks on this that we didn't talk about last time. So it's going to be exciting to pick through these and to see some of the variations in the kind of music that he's done. So I thought we'd start with my first one, and I thought we'd start with the one we mentioned just briefly, the one that he is, for people who are more casual maybe about cinema and about film music, probably the track that he is most well known for on the face of it, which is the main theme from The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, the Sergio Leone film from 1966, the first in the Dollars trilogy, probably one of, if not the most well-known Western, well, certainly spaghetti Western in cinema history. Clint Eastwood, the man with no name, and the classic whistling, you know, kind of tune. Now, this is, I mean, it's legendary along the level of certain of the things that we've talked about in this podcast before: the Superman theme, the Indiana Jones theme, the James Bond theme. This is one of those tracks from a particularly brilliant album that transcends traditional film music in terms of popular culture. I think this is one that goes beyond. This is one that people will hum, and even if they don't know necessarily the name of the composer, even if they don't know much about the movie itself, they will know this. And I think that is another example of a composer who has gone beyond what film composers traditionally do, to have a track, have a piece of music that is so signature to a particular time, to a particular place, and well known amongst society as a whole.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'd put it up there with, you mentioned the film music classics there, I'd put it up there with the likes of Beethoven's Ninth, Ode to Joy. Pretty much, one need not have a grounding in Beethoven to know what Ode to Joy is. You play a few notes of Ode to Joy, you know exactly what that is, regardless of how familiar you are with the rest of Beethoven's canon. I'd say The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is up there with that easily, and frankly, you don't get higher praise than that. I mean, it's interesting that a lot of Morricone's Western music was covered by pop artists throughout the 1960s. I believe it was Hugo Montenegro covered The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And again, to have pop artists covering something that is inherently classical shows how much the music broke out into the mainstream. The fact that someone felt the need to do that showed that Morricone's instrumental and harmonic choices and his rhythmic choices clearly had popular appeal beyond the perceived limitations of classical music, which was amazing. I mean, I think, yeah, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is magnificent. You're right. The album is really well put together. There isn't a wasted note. There isn't a wasted track. It covers a host of different styles. And I think, again, it's important to reinforce that, you know, the main theme is very, very famous and deservedly so. There is so much more going on in this score than the main theme. And anyone listening to this, I would encourage them to look beyond the main theme and actually play the entire album, because there are so many highlights. I mean, clearly you have the Ecstasy of Gold track, which allows me to introduce the soprano vocalist Eda Dell'Orso, who we'll be referring to a lot throughout this podcast, the extraordinary voice of Eda Dell'Orso with whom Morricone worked repeatedly. You also have the track "The Carriage of the Spirits" with Dell'Orso's voice, the soaring choir. You have the famously tense bit of Spanish music where Lee Van Cleef as the bad turns up at the beginning, and you have this sense of broiling menace, which is just brilliantly well done. And then you have because The Good, the Bad and the Ugly is a Civil War story, and the fact that the three characters, their fates end up intersecting with the soldiers in the Civil War in their quest for gold. You have the story of the soldier theme, which is actually performed within the context of the film itself. So it's a piece of Morricone music that's heard being performed within the film, but it also exists outside the world of the film. So it's like diegetic, non-diegetic. There's so much going on in this score. I mean, it's no wonder it's as well regarded as it is. And I watched the final showdown, the final duel, the trio scene and track with the three of them. And as the space between the characters closes in, so you go from these extreme long shots to the extreme close-ups on the faces, and the music increases in operatic intensity as the focus of the camera narrows, and it's just magnificently done. What the music is saying is that faces are their own kind of operatic landscapes. It's so brilliant, and that is such a cliche. I mean, Morricone invented those cliches, and I think it's very easy to take for granted now because everyone ripped that off. You know, everyone ripped off that approach to music in the years since, and they ripped off the visual language as well. I think it's important to go back to where it all started.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. And it's a key point for Morricone's career, I guess, you know, in terms of becoming more of a name in film composing, and particularly in the United States. And as you say, it was a hit. The soundtrack, the actual album to the soundtrack was on the charts for more than a year. It got to number 4 on the Billboard Pop Album chart, as you say. The main theme was a hit in 1968, and that again is something that doesn't always happen, you know, especially for this kind of music. And I think it's fantastic that it resonated and it struck such a chord, because it is a brilliant album, absolutely. And we are going to return to it briefly towards the end of this podcast, because one of my other choices is from this album, and I think it's in fact my favourite piece. I think my favourite piece of Morricone music, actually, I have to say. But we will come to that towards the end. But we're going to move into slightly different territory now with the next choice. because you've gone for, we're jumping ahead a couple of decades now, you've gone for Falls from The Mission.
The Mission is the Roland Joffe film from 1986, very famous, about Jesuit missionaries in Latin America who are attempting to preach the word of God to the indigenous cultures. So it's clearly, the subject matter would clearly be catnip to any composer, but particularly someone like Morricone, who always had an extraordinary sense of divinity and spirituality in this movie. This story is the perfect outlet for Morricone to unleash that side of him, and it resulted in arguably one of the most sort of toweringly beautiful film scores ever composed. It was remarkably successful, one of the best-selling film scores of all time. Very, very, very famous largely because of the track that I haven't selected, which was Gabriel's Oboe, which was a staple of classical music albums the world over. I suppose it's important to say, look, well, in terms of when I first heard Morricone was probably, well, through my dad, because my dad introduced me to the spaghetti westerns when I was probably like 11, 12 years old. And although I don't remember taking the films in, the music clearly imprinted on me. And I think it's important to remember that throughout the 1990s into the early 2000s, there were loads and loads of chill-out albums that were released, like repeatedly. They were all over the place. And my dad always used to collect those. He used to buy them. And Morricone was always on those, which is another sign of how remarkable he was. He could cross over into the mainstream populist sphere, and the score for The Mission was always on those albums, particularly Gabriel's Oboe, which is an interesting story. I looked this up. So Jeremy Irons plays the character of Gabriel in the movie, and he performs the oboe. Well, he mimes playing the oboe in the film, and then that's obviously overdubbed with the music. Apparently, Morricone was inspired to come up with the notes for the theme by Jeremy Irons' finger placements as he was miming playing the instrument on the set, which is it resulted in a gorgeous theme that's very, very famous. I chose the track Falls, which is the opening track, because I think it might be even more beautiful, and it introduces what is ostensibly the main theme, which goes from panpipes, and panpipes were often used in Morricone's scores. We're probably going to mention that again at some point, into this soaring string elegy that speaks of the landscapes, and it speaks of the kind of divine quest of the characters. I mean, Morricone had a really, again, I've used this word a lot, astonishing ability to leap beyond the frame and to suggest something genuinely transcendent and genuinely awe-inspiring. Again, it's almost like he was touched by divinity himself through his music, and Falls is just brilliant. I mean, I defy anyone to listen to the string progressions in this and not be moved by it. It's among several jaw-dropping pieces in the score. Yeah, if you're talking accomplishments in film music and accomplishments in Morricone's career, this is up there, definitely.
Yeah, it's gorgeous, isn't it? Absolutely gorgeous score. And there was some controversy because it was nominated for an Oscar, but it didn't win that year. In 1987, I think it would have, or 1986. And it lost to a film called Round Midnight, which was scored by Herbie Hancock, the jazz musician. And Round Midnight is a film by a guy called Bertrand Tavernier, which from the mid-80s, which is not American-French musical drama, which I'd never heard of until literally looking at it now. So it's not like passed through into the lore of cinema. And it was a hell of a category that year, including James Horner's score for Aliens, Jerry Goldsmith's score for Hoosiers, and then Morricone's score for The Mission. And he said, apparently Morricone said, because he finally won an Oscar for The Hateful Eight in 2015, he said in an interview, "I definitely felt I should have won for The Mission, especially when you consider that the Oscar winner that year was Round Midnight, which was not an original score. It had a very good arrangement by Herbie Hancock, but it used existing pieces, so there could be no comparison with The Mission. There was a theft!"
you can just imagine the kind of Italian inflection.
Yeah. There was a theft. Yeah, absolutely. And he's. I mean, you know, it's a hell of a list of films, and I think a lot of people would say that Aliens is another classic score, but how can you not give this to The Mission? You know, I mean, even with those scores around it, this is just something sublime. So, I mean, again, another example of how, you know, the Oscars don't necessarily always recognise absolute masterpiece film scores when they should.
No, I mean the Oscars know bugger all about music anyway. You know, they're
just say it like it is, there, Sean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I'm completely with Morricone on that. I mean, it's remarkable to think that he didn't win an Oscar until The Hateful Eight. He did get an honorary Oscar in 2007, I believe, but I believe he was only actually outside of The Hateful Eight. I believe he was only nominated about another 6 times, which
That's
is
mad.
It's just extraordinary. You think that the people that don't have Oscars, so Ennio Morricone didn't get an Oscar. So just to put this in context, Gwyneth Paltrow got an Oscar before Ennio Morricone did. I mean, how does that how does that work? I mean, Gwyneth Paltrow done some very, very fine work, but really? I mean, I know it's kind of like apples and oranges, isn't it? But it's I suppose when you put it like that, you know, without wanting to be too mean towards Gwyneth Paltrow, but seriously, like,
I know you think, well, how does that, how does that even work? I mean, for a lot of people, it might be one of his favourite pieces of work, I think, and I mean, you can understand why. It's just stunning, absolutely stunning from start to finish. So for my next piece, I've gone for something that is maybe a little bit more experimental than the two that we've previously featured here, in a way. I'm not saying better, but definitely along different lines. I've gone for A Silhouette of Doom by Morricone, which was featured on the score and was sort of repopularised. That's where I first heard it, in the score for Kill Bill Volume 2 from Tarantino. And obviously we just mentioned The Hateful Eight, which he won the Oscar for because Tarantino managed to convince him to come and actually score The Hateful Eight after there'd been some tension, I think, previously about Tarantino using Morricone's score tracks from Morricone's films in some of his work previously, some of his films. I think there'd been. I seem to remember there being tension there, that Morricone was moaning about this, and then Tarantino managed to get him involved. But A Silhouette of Doom is... I found it a really striking piece when I listened to... Because the Kill Bill albums, obviously, like all of Tarantino's films, have a real mix of, you know, old school pop tunes, classical themes, Western themes, all these kind of different things. Themes from different countries, all that stuff. So it's a real hodgepodge of an album. But I loved this track, A Silhouette of Doom, because it really captures a sense of foreboding strangeness and escalating tension. And I think if I remember rightly, it's set to the point where it's just about to kick off with Bill in the final fight. It's been a while since I've watched the film, but I feel like it's around that point. And I just think, and I didn't know at first it was Morricone when I first watched the film, and then when I went back and I started to get more into Morricone's music and listen to it more, I was like, oh yeah, of course. But I think this is a great piece. And but for the life of me, I can't remember where it originates from. You might know this, Sean, because it's certainly not for Kill Bill Volume 2, you know?
No, I mean, Tarantino is a magpie, and he alights on what he wants, and he steals like various little bits and puts it in and throws it together. In the process, often creating extraordinary soundtrack albums. In fact, one of the reasons why we ought to love Tarantino is for bringing popular attention to the likes of these relatively obscure Morricone tracks and others. That's one of the reasons to admire him. I looked into this. Apparently, this is from a film called Navajo Joe, which is a 1960s spaghetti western. Directed by Sergio Corbucci, starring Burt Reynolds as the eponymous Navajo Joe. So you have Burt Reynolds playing a Native American character, which is very, very odd. Apparently, looking into it, Burt Reynolds was under the impression that he was going to be working with Sergio Leone. It's like, oh no, it's a different Sergio. Apparently, that didn't work out quite as he expected. So, relatively obscure film. Trust that Tarantino would know about it, because of course Tarantino has got an encyclopedic knowledge of these things. Yeah, and there is a suite of music online, including Silhouette of Doom, from this score, and it's brilliant. It's really good. I suppose the spaghetti western scores for the Dollars trilogy were being composed around the same time, which I suppose were more melodic and elegiac, and then of course that builds into Once Upon a Time in the West. As you said, we talked about that on a previous episode, which people can go and seek out. This is more kind of angular and punky and edgy, and I think I went back and looked up the clip that this is used in. It's the scene in the second film where Uma Thurman and Daryl Hannah are about to they're facing off at each other in the trailer. And then that results in and then you find out that Daryl Hannah killed the Pai Mei character, Uma Thurman's mentor, and that results in them sort of locking swords. And then Uma Thurman plucks out Daryl Hannah's eye.
Oh yeah, I remember that now.
So again, the music is so brilliantly used in the scene. You'd think that it had been organically created for that specific scene, but it hadn't. Obviously, it originated decades before that. That's one of the reasons to like Tarantino is the way that he throws in these kind of things. I think it's great. I hadn't listened to this track on its own before you suggested it. I'm really glad that you included it. One of the great pleasures about doing this particular podcast is that in preparation for it, I went and looked up so many Morricone scores that I hadn't heard, this being one of them. And I'm just like, wow, this individual was really one of a kind. I don't really know how someone can have such a bottomless well of inspiration. How can someone think of throwing together so many different tonal styles, instrumental choices, and yet make it compelling? One of the great things about Morricone's music, apart from possibly when he goes into really dissonant thriller territory, because he did do scores like that are quite difficult to listen to, but for the most part, his scores are very listenable. You can put them on, and definitely. You're engaged with them, aren't you? Like this.
Yeah, you absolutely are. You can just, even without the context, we've spoken many times on this podcast about how some films you can't listen to without the score. You've some scores you can't listen to without the film, and that you need that there. Many of the best, you don't need the context for what's happening on screen, and definitely is the case with this. With this track and all the others. They're just beautiful pieces of music you can just put on. And this is different. This one is, as you say, quite angular and experimental. So it's not quite as easy to sort of throw on and listen to as say Falls would be, as we've previously mentioned. But it's still fascinating. It's still really good, and it shows some of the different things that he would do and some of the variations he would play, as you say. So yeah, I love it, and it was. I actually feel like the score, the soundtrack to Kill Bill Volume 2 is better than the film. So I actually love the kind of things that are in there. So yeah, it's a really good one. Your next one, Sean, you've gone for one that's maybe a bit more obscure. Thankfully, because you're more of a film music encyclopedia and knowledge base, you can pluck out
in name only.
You can pluck out things from things that I haven't even heard of before, which is great. And this is one of them. So it's from a 1997 British-Italian television drama miniseries called Nostromo, which Morricone scores. It's an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's epic story Nostromo of political upheaval, greed and romance in turn of the 20th century South America, starring a range of actors from different nationalities, but more recognisable names would be Albert Finney, Colin Firth, Joaquim de Almeida, Brian Dennehy, people like that. So I'd not heard of this, but the track you've gone for, The Silver of the Mine, is gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous piece. So was this one that you knew of previously for a long time, or did you discover it while you were discovering Morricone again?
I've got this album on CD, and I have to say I've never seen the series. I think the series has fallen into obscurity. One of the great ironies of Morricone's career is that he scored so much stuff that the vast majority of the stuff that he did score has fallen into obscurity, and you won't, very often you have to listen to the music without knowing what the context is, which is kind of a violation of the rule that I would normally adhere to, which is, okay, one needs to understand the film before one understands the music, but so powerful and so overwhelming is Morricone's music in general that one can actually listen to it and get a sense of what the context is without actually having seen the original film or TV series. So, and I think one of the things that I wanted to do on this podcast was I haven't selected any spaghetti western scores. I've tried not to select the scores for which Morricone is most famous, because I think there is so much else going on elsewhere in his career, and I think it balances out really, really well with what you've picked. We've got those two facets of his career, the stuff that you know and the stuff that perhaps people don't know. And I very much went for the latter. And yeah, The Silver of the Mine, I think, might be the most extraordinary thing that Morricone composed, and my God, that's saying something given all the stuff we've already cited throughout the course of this podcast. I mean, it's every now and then you get a piece of music, whether it's from Morricone or somebody else, where you listen to it and it stops you in your tracks because it's so beautiful. You just think, my goodness me, I don't know how someone can come up with something as beautiful as that. I genuinely don't know where that came from, and what I wouldn't give to get inside the mind of the person that came up with that. It's astonishing. Again, I don't know the context of the series. I can imagine if it's called The Silver of the Mine, it involves some kind of colonial discovery based on the fact this is taken from the Joseph Conrad novel. There is a kind of awe of discovery. There is this awe of having stumbled on something, of a quest having been reached. I would assume that's the principle behind it. But again, you have the Eda Del Orso soprano vocal, which alternates with the strings. So what you have is the theme is introduced on the strings, then it's thrown over to her voice, and then the vocals and the strings combine at the end of the track, and it just proceeds to elevate in gorgeousness over 5 minutes. Just when you think it's peaked, it keeps getting better and better. And much of the rest of the score is like that. There are, given the nature of the story, there are very, very dark, angry pieces. Morricone was an experimentalist, as he said, and not all of Morricone's music was lush and sweeping. There's some very, very uncomfortable textures that he was very, very good at coming up with. But for the most part, this is a score that appears to be aglow with the joy of discovery. And I'm just astonished that someone can come up with something like this. I think it's incredible.
Yeah, really beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And I've heard of the story Nostromo. I haven't read it, admittedly, but I've heard of it. And when I hear the word Nostromo, I immediately think of Alien. Because that's where they got the name of the ship from in Alien. But so I'd not seen this, and I didn't know it existed, to be honest. But I think the score is gorgeous, and this isn't the first example of Morricone scoring for something for television. The last example, I should say, of Morricone scoring something for television that we'll get to in this list. But yeah, sumptuous, absolutely gorgeous.
I suppose the only other thing I wanted to bring up was it actually the show also has a role for Claudia Cardinale, who was in Once Upon a Time in the West.
Okay.
For whom Morricone scored Jill's theme, again with Eda Del Orso's voice, which is one of the most soaringly beautiful bits of film music ever. So there is a connection there as well. And
as you say, I think we talked about that specific thing with Claudia Cardinale in our last episode. So that's something to go and seek out. In the next one, you have summed it up where you say that I've picked the more well-known Morricone and you've gone for the more deep dive stuff, which is great. And the next one is probably one of his most famous, Deborah's theme from Once Upon a Time in America, which was Sergio Leone's last movie, mid-80s, epic story about two brothers in New York City rising to prominence amongst the ghetto, and just a stunning score, which has just gone down in history, as being absolutely beautiful. And Deborah's theme is probably one of the most signature pieces that he ever did in many ways. Although it was, and I don't know the actual film, but it was apparently written in the mid-1970s for another movie, but was rejected, Deborah's theme. And then Morricone had it, gave it to Leone, who wasn't sure to put it in because it was similar to the main title music for Once Upon a Time in the West. But he did, and then, history was made because it's beautiful. It's an absolutely gorgeous piece of music for a fantastic album.
It's so famous, isn't it? Again, one of those Morricone tracks, you'd only have to play a few seconds of it and you would know that it was Morricone, and you probably know what the track was as well. It's another one of those really famous bits of film music that turned up on countless compilation albums and chill out albums, and it's heartbreaking. It's a really heartbreaking theme, and those who've seen the film will know why. And again, the use of Eda Del Orso's soprano vocal done in a very quiet, mournful way, as opposed to the soaring majesty of something like The Good, the Bad and the Ugly and Nostromo. It's on a very, very low register in this score. I was listening to this score in its entirety just prior to recording this podcast, and I hadn't listened to it all the way through in a while. I've got it on CD, and I was blown away by the variety of styles that are in it. I was really struck by that. And again, I've mentioned this already, how Morricone saw himself as an experimentalist, and the way that this particular score it's almost like a kaleidoscope. You have various different styles and emotions all circling around each other. So you go from the film it's a story about memory. So Robert De Niro's character is remembering his youth, and he obviously co-stars in the film with James Woods. So the idea is the movie is a journey into the past, and it's a journey about regrets and unfulfilled issues, and obviously opium-induced memory. That's really important. The film begins and ends in an opium den, and what the score does is it moves from the score has got a kind of wistful air. It's almost like the score attains the sense of a memory being dredged up from the past, and it does this through the orchestrations and the harmonics, and you go from this wistful piano theme to the long line tragedy of Deborah's theme to Prohibition era jazz. I think the really acutely observed jazz numbers are really well done and really well researched and very authentic. So you go from that, and then all of this stuff kind of glides around. The score attains the fluidity of memory, and that's really hard to do. It does it in a way that isn't haphazard or bitty or all over the place. The score flows beautifully well. It's just a really remarkable piece of work. I mean, it's a shame because I looked into the history of the film. Apparently, there was a European cut of the film, and then there was a butchered American theatrical cut of the movie that was met with very, very negative reviews. And it's a shame that had to happen to Sergio Leone at the very end of his career. And it's a shame that it had to happen in his final collaboration with Morricone. But the music and ultimately the film has been reassessed, is so majestic that it's transcended the troubled production of the film, and it's one of those Morricone scores that's really broken out with people, and deservedly so. I mean, I was listening to the end. The album ends with a 13-minute suite of just variations on all the different themes, and I'm absolutely blown away at how can one man have so much inspiration within him? How can you find so many variations on themes? And where do you come up with those themes in the first place? Again, it's just jaw-dropping.
Especially considering that because the film took so long as well, he didn't finish composing most of it before actual scenes had been filmed, and he was playing pieces on set as filming took place, which had happened in Once Upon a Time in the West. And just you think that he was playing music, he was composing music for without the context, but it fits so brilliantly. I mean, he's so in tune. I think he's one of those composers that's so in tune with what he's doing that it doesn't matter. I mean, it's just amazing to behold.
I mean, I suppose one of the things to say about Morricone is he was a very, very singular character. He never learned English. He never left Rome, although he obviously worked extensively in Hollywood. He never left Rome. He was always based in Rome. He was a very, very singular character, and I think sometimes like you're right, there was a tendency to write music based on the script without seeing the rushes, without seeing the rough cut, and I think that obviously worked with Sergio Leone because Sergio Leone had an operatic sensibility, and the music would mold the visuals would be molded to the music, which is relatively unusual in terms of film music composition. I think sometimes that didn't work with Morricone. There's famously people can go and there are two music journalists that I know we both admire, James Southall and John Broxton of moviewave.net and moviemusicuk.us respectively. Anyone who is even remotely interested in Morricone, go and look up the reviews that these two people have done, because there's a vast repository of reviews, really well considered analysis on Morricone's music. And one of the famous examples of a Morricone project that didn't work out was apparently he wrote the initial score for What Dreams May Come, the Robin Williams film, for Vincent Ward, and apparently that didn't work. It was too liturgical, it was too ecclesiastical, too heavy, maybe too oppressive for the film, and they threw that out, and they got Michael Kamen in to write something that was melodic but maybe relatively more accessible. So it didn't always work, and I think there was maybe sometimes Morricone, so just so we don't turn this into a hagiography, I think maybe there might have occasionally on the part of Morricone being a tendency to score based on impressions in the script rather than seeing the visuals. I think that's what happened with John Carpenter's remake of The Thing, which I'd consider to be one of the great horror films of all time. Apparently, what Morricone did was he wrote slabs of creepy experimental music that he then presented to John Carpenter, and then John Carpenter famously ended up throwing a lot of that out. And there's one particular track, the Humanity Part 2, I think, with that pulsating electronic heartbeat, which is just so chilling, which ended up being repeated more in the score than Morricone had intended, and then Carpenter himself bulked that up with these kind of impressionistic electronic textures. So that was a bit of a messy situation where maybe the communication between the director and composer wasn't quite there as it would have been with Leone. But I'm so glad you picked Once Upon a Time in America, because it was a joy to go back and listen to that again. It's a masterpiece.
I was gonna bring The Thing up actually as a good example of that, like you were just talking about. And I suppose John Carpenter's got a bit of stick for that over the years, I think, for not actually going with the master for this. But it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because you've got to make the right choice for your film, and I think most people would agree that some of the music for The Thing is fantastic. Particularly what he brings to that, and there are people out there who would say that Morricone's score would probably have been better. And that's depends on your point of view, really, I think. But it's got to be, even with a master, it's got to be right for the movie. And I think 99% of the time, I think it was. He brought something to a film that elevates the whole thing. But yeah, I think in some cases it's maybe unfair to pillory a director for maybe having good on John Carpenter for having the strength to say, no, I don't think this works. For somebody by that point who was already well established, an iconic film composer, I kind of admire the choice to actually go, well, maybe this isn't quite what I want, as opposed to just going for it and accepting it. And that's it's like I say, it's got to be the right combination.
There are, if you listen to the Thing's score in isolation, there are tracks on the album that are clearly too big and they're too grandiose for the movie. The great thing about the movie is how claustrophobic it is and how limited in its environment and how limited in the number of characters that it is. I think the music would have overtaken the movie. Some tracks on that album that weren't used would have overtaken the movie, and that would have been to the detriment of the movie. Again, this is where communication between director and composer is very, very important. It's obviously made quite tricky by the fact that Morricone again deliberately didn't learn to speak English and deliberately didn't leave Rome. So there was maybe that kind of communication issue with certain directors. Obviously, he worked with many, many Hollywood directors and didn't have any problem with them at all, like Brian De Palma, for instance. We'll get to that. But yeah, I think Carpenter made the right decision in that instance. It's one of those cases where I'm on the side of the director. The Morricone tracks that he did use in The Thing are devastatingly effective. Really, the autopsy scene where they bring it back from the Norwegian camp and they unfurl it, and you've got those icy, spine-pricklingly creepy strings as the camera tracks along the table and you're looking at this thing. The iciness, again, that's the word, the iciness of the score in that particular is really well done. That is the tone I think that Morricone should have. It's the tone that he largely did strive for throughout the thing. There are certain tracks that I think are maybe a bit too bombastic for their own good.
I think a collaboration that did seem to pay dividends a bit more is your next one, Sean, which is with Terrence Malick for Days of Heaven, the 1978 period drama romance starring Richard Gere, Brooke Adams, set in 1916, who are about two lovers harvesting crops in the Texas panhandle for a wealthy farmer, and and they end up tricking him into a false marriage to try and claim his fortune. And it's a film that I've seen it. I saw it last year. I think I watched Days of Heaven actually, and this was Malick's second film after Badlands. I don't know if it was then he had his 20-year break and then did The Thin Red Line.
Yeah, it was. It was a 20-year gap of this, yeah.
Yeah, and obviously Terrence Malick is well known for being quite difficult himself. And Morricone's score is lovely for this. And he said about working with Malick, he was quite demanding. He didn't know me very well, so he made suggestions and in some cases gave musical solutions. This kind of annoyed me because he'd say, this thing try it with three flutes. Something impossible. So to humour him, I would do it with 3 flutes, and then he'd decide to use my version after all. His was impossible, or I would have written it myself. And more nitpicking like that, which means he was very attentive and careful about music. So that sounds a little bit like a collaboration that worked, even though it was quite, at times, prickly, and maybe Malick wanted things that Morricone knew wouldn't quite fit, but it came out, in the end, to be something quite beautiful.
Yeah, it's a ravishingly beautiful piece of work. Yeah, so obviously with Terrence Malick's films one would imagine they are tailor-made for film composers because they are visually driven. The famous thing about Days of Heaven is that it's shot at the golden hour, where you get that beautiful glow from the cinematography. It's a stunningly beautiful film to look at. And clearly, Terrence Malick's films have got more kind of impressionistic and fragmented. I mean, you'll always know if it's a Terrence Malick film when you start with a shot of rustling grass. It's like, I love being outside, or something like that, and you kind of like,
yeah.
eh? And it's like, so being outside, I'm in touch with a higher power, and you're like, what? Speak up a bit, and like that. And that's the kind of frustrating thing about Terrence Malick's films. But I think Days of Heaven is one of his better, in relative terms, it's one of his more relatively narrative-driven films. Morricone's score is really, really stunning. It's interesting that it sits alongside the Saint-Saëns Carnival of the Animals, with a very, very famous piece of classical music. I'm sure everyone will have heard that, which actually opens the film. So it's been compelled to sit alongside that. I can only assume that was a Malick decision, right? I'm going to have Saint-Saëns in there. That's not moving. That's staying over the opening sequence. Morricone, you're going to have to put your own music alongside that, and the two things are going to kind of coexist. But it works really well. And the main theme, The Harvest, is just one of the most devastatingly gorgeous themes I think Morricone came up with. It's pastoral. Again, it's interesting. I hadn't heard that quote before that you said about the use of the flutes. I mean, the flutes are placed in the sound mix along with these very elegiac, very steady strings, and it's lovely. But there's a sense of darkness and melancholy underneath it as well. It's quite a wise score. It recognises that. I think that beauty comes with an underlying cost, which is very, very appropriate. For those who've seen the film, anyone will know that that's very appropriate, because there is the onset of mechanisation, and there is also a fire sequence, which is kind of very shattering and very upsetting. And Morricone's score generally darkens as it goes on, and you get, as the mechanisation takes hold, the orchestration changes. You get more like low register piano and dissonant strings, which is not probably more akin to what Jerry Goldsmith might have done as well. But sitting alongside those darker pieces are just some of the most shimmeringly lovely things that Morricone came up with. There's a track called Happiness, which is led by the flute. And you just think, like with all the other scores that we've talked about in this podcast, I don't know how someone can come up with something as lovely as that. I genuinely don't know where they find the melodic inspiration. That scene is actually online, the Happiness scene, and you can hear how well mixed the score is in the movie. I mean, the score is the movie is very dark. It's narration driven. I believe it's Linda Mance, I believe, is the main character who narrates a lot of the movie, and clearly that would present a challenge for any composer to come up with music that would not compete with the voiceover, but would sit alongside it and sort of draw out the deeper themes of the story. And I think Morricone judged it perfectly. And I believe this was the first score for which he was Oscar nominated, which is remarkable given what he'd come up with before.
Like, crazy, isn't it? Really, that's it. You know, this is the first one. I mean, I don't. He didn't win, obviously. I don't know off the top of my head who
that would have been. Giorgio Moroder for Midnight Express. I've just looked it up, which is kind of. Now, it's like, for goodness sake, I mean, like that year you had John Williams with Superman, Jerry Goldsmith with Boys from Brazil, and Ennio Morricone with this, and they give it to Giorgio Moroder for Midnight Express.
We talked about this. We talked about this before. I think in our last series of podcasts last year, I think this came up when we were talking about, maybe it was Jerry Goldsmith actually, or at some point we've discussed this, and we were like, what? How did this happen?
Yeah.
Another, Oscar, robbed situation, really. But yeah, it's a fantastic score, absolutely beautiful. My next one then is going back to the spaghetti western, going back to Sergio Leone, there's a common theme with a lot of my scores here because they go back to the Leone films, the collaborations. This one for probably one of Leone's lesser-known films, actually, and one that I saw fairly recently, which I thought was bonkers but great, which was A Fistful of Dynamite, also known as Doc, You Sucker, which is one of the best titles ever. Like, I love that. It's a Zapata Western film starring Rod Steiger in full Rod Steiger mode.
I was just going to say, Rod, I played the mad priest in the Amityville Horror Steiger.
Yeah.
Do you remember that when he?
I'm going to shout all the way.
Do you remember?
I'm going to shout through every film.
Oh my lord! Do you remember the bit when he's in the house and he's covered in all the flies and he just wants to look? This one looks like he wants to lie down and have a nap.
I love him. Rod Steiger's great in most films he's in. He's just, he's great, and he's fun in this because he plays. I mean, in this, really, it's racially dodgy casting because he plays a Mexican guy, and it should have really been a Mexican actor. And if it was made today, it would be. So, but he's all this kind of grouchy Mexican kind of thing going on, and even though culturally it's a bit wobbly, it's very fun to watch. And alongside James Coburn as this quite suave Irish Republican Army revolutionary, and it's about those two, and it's a kind of, it's almost like a weird twisted sort of love story almost in a way in the middle of like a revolution, and it's a bizarre and involving like a heist and a bank robbery. It's a bizarre film, one I actually really liked, and it's and it's got some fascinating stuff in the background of how it was developed and all this kind of thing. But the music is really good. It's I wouldn't say it's necessarily as good as the Dollars trilogy music, but there are some fantastic things, particularly the main track for this, which has some stunning. It's a stunning mixture of traditional kind of guitars and all and flavors alongside the Mexican aspect, but it's got this. It's very fitting, Sean, because it has a particular melody in it that we've joked about this before, that ends up going Sean, 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 which is how really we should start this podcast every week, with me going
can we just have that as the intro music?
maybe, but it's set to this really sort of strange and beautiful sort of flashback sequence or sort of vision sequence of James Coburn copping off with this woman in a garden in Ireland, which this sort of beautiful utopian version of Ireland in like 1910 with like misty kind of visuals and all this kind of it's a good one. It's fascinating, and I think it's one of the films and maybe one of the scores that's maybe a little bit overlooked.
Yeah, certainly I haven't seen the film and I hadn't heard the score at all apart from the main theme before I started to prepare for this podcast, and it's definitely Morricone on much more playful, eccentric form. I mean, most of his Western scores, if not all of them, were eccentric, but this one particularly so. Again, the use of the Sean, like that is just. I mean, no other composer would have done that. It's presented in a decidedly non-ironic fashion. No other composer would have been audacious enough to actually have a choir sing the name of the main character. It's really remarkable, but the way that I've talked about is the use of alternating rhythmic styles and harmonics to go from sort of whistling to the Sean vocals to the kind of clip-clop piano to the pipe organ and then back again. You almost come like full circle. It's really charming, and I don't know if any other composer could have made this as charming as Morricone did. And it absolutely coheres. It coheres brilliantly. I haven't seen the film, but I felt listening to the score on its own that it communicated the narrative of the film brilliantly. Particularly I'm divining from the music that there is a real sense of melancholy and sadness in the James Coburn character. Right, that's the impression I got.
He's sort of wistful for the world he used to inhabit. Basically,
yeah, and there is a scene that I looked up online where I believe it's probably the scene where Rod Steiger and James Coburn meet for the first time. James Coburn gets off a bike and walks towards him and takes the goggles off, and you have the classic Morricone, the percussion kind of woodwind vocal arrangements, which strike a decidedly whimsical note. And there's a badass line that James Coburn says, because he's got nitroglycerine with him and he knows they won't shoot him, and he demonstrates a little drop of this. He's like, if he says, if you shoot me, you'll have to redraw maps of this entire area because the explosion is
something like that. Yeah,
it's amazing. I'm paraphrasing there, but based on the isolated scenes that I've watched, Morricone's score is magnificently well tailored to the movie. But then, of course, you would expect that he's working in the Western spaghetti Western realm. Yeah, I thought it was just mesmerising, and it's a shame that it's not as well known as the other spaghetti westerns. I looked into the history of the film. Apparently, A Fistful of Dynamite was the re-edited American cut of the movie, and apparently it was treated quite badly by the distributors. I can only assume that is why people don't cite this as readily as they would The Good, the Bad and the Ugly or Once Upon a Time in the West. But it's really experimental, really weird, and yet oddly hypnotic, and again charming, as I said. I love it.
And to be honest, I think you could describe the film in similar terms, actually, as a movie. And it's not as good as the Dollars trilogy, and I think that's one of the reasons, or necessarily Once Upon a Time in America, and I think that's one of the reasons it's lesser known. But it is different, and it's fascinating. There's a really good release of it. I think it's Arrow who put it out last year with some fantastic detail on this, and some really interesting interviews and things like that with people, which goes into a lot of detail. So I'd encourage anyone to get that. But yeah, it's great. It's really good. We're going to do two of yours on the bounce, so we can finish on my last one, so to bookend the podcast. So your next one is from another TV show, the main theme from Padre Pio.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about obscure Ennio Morricone projects. I don't know anything about this apart from the general synopsis, which that it's based on the life of Roman Catholic friar and Saint Padre Pio, directed by Franco Bernini, starring Michel Placido. I don't know anything about it apart from that. It's probably never been shown in the UK. It's probably never been shown outside Italy, I would imagine. As you said, released in 2000. I came across Morricone's main theme for this some years ago now, and again, it just stopped me in my tracks. I was like, wow, you can genuinely tell when Morricone is inspired by something, because that standard of excellence is kind of taken to the next level. And when Morricone's excellence is taken to the next level, boy, does it stop you, and boy, do you take notice of it. Clearly, the themes of the story, it's sort of based on a true story, so it's a Roman Catholic friar. It's an Italian production. It's obviously a very, very personal project for Morricone to take on, one would imagine, and therefore, as always with film composers, if they feel the material in their bones, the music is going to be more extraordinary than it otherwise would have been. And the use of the trumpets and the choir and the timpani in the main theme, which is then threaded throughout the rest of the score, just strikes a heavenly ecclesiastical note that only Morricone could have done. And again, I'm not listening to it thinking, well, this melody sounds like The Mission or Once Upon a Time in the West or whatever. I don't think that. I just think this is a stunningly beautiful original theme, tailor-made for this particular production. It sounds like Morricone, but Morricone isn't ripping himself off. I'm listening to it thinking, I don't know how someone can compose something as majestic as this. It's really, really, really quite remarkable. And as I've said, one of the ironies of Morricone's career is that people might not even see the production which the music accompanied, but it kind of doesn't matter. We've got the music,
and that's it. You really don't need it, and that again is a testament to Morricone, as we've said. And I suppose I suppose it would form something of a companion in a way to The Mission, in some sense, in that they're both revolving around the Catholic religious narratives, different kinds of stories, but essentially still reaching for that heavenly aspect, I guess, and that idea of religion and Catholicism, which is, I think not every composer would lean towards, I think, and depending on your religious denomination and things like this, but it does give you the chance to sort of have some of these sweeping, beautiful melodies, you know, to be able to. I mean, ultimately, this is the story of a guy who was canonized. You know, he became a saint in the end because he died in 1968. And then he was subsequently, for the fact he had stigmata all his life, he was subsequently canonised by the Vatican. So, you know, you're reaching to lofty heights here in terms of what you can do with music, and I think he does a great job.
Lofty is exactly the word. Yeah, you do genuinely get a sense that the score is yearning and reaching for something beyond the kind of material realm, which Morricone did that magnificently. I think, yeah, to compare it to The Mission, you're absolutely right. Tonally, it's very similar to The Mission. And this is for a TV production. It's like, you know, you think most directors would be happy to have this in a feature film. This was for television. That's how remarkable Morricone was.
I suppose he picked the project that he thought he could do the most with, and that's great in that he was able to cross over between TV and cinema, you know, and didn't worry about doing that. I mean, this was 2000, so this is where he's, you know, well established by this point. So yeah, fascinating stuff. Even if I never see, and I never probably will see the film, if we got the music to enjoy. Your last one is a real outlier, I think, in terms of the kind of film that he would normally score, because you've gone for Casualties of War, which is a war film, from American war film, 1989. Probably a lesser known project for a lot of the people involved. Michael J. Fox, Sean Penn, directed by Brian De Palma, about an incident during the Vietnam War in 1966, in which a Vietnamese woman was kidnapped from a village by a squad of American soldiers who raped and murdered her. So this is really dark stuff. I mean, what was the... And it's a really fantastic piece of music, but what was the thought process behind Morricone doing this?
I mean, I can only assume it's because he worked with De Palma before on The Untouchables, which was a very famous score that we could have included that on here.
Yeah.
Neither of us included it in the end. But yeah, and The Untouchables is one of the most famous Hollywood scores composed by Morricone. I think Brian De Palma famously indulges composers. Brian De Palma can elicit normally fantastic music from his composers, and many, many examples of this. You think of, for example, Pino Donaggio with Carrie. He's got a very, very good, although Brian De Palma is often derided as kind of like an empty visual stylist, he understands music and he understands how to use music. You think of Danny Elfman's music on Mission Impossible as well, which apparently replaced an original score from Alan Silvestri. So he and Morricone were clearly excellent collaborators. After this, there would be, I believe, an 11-year gap until Mission to Mars, which was a very, very controversial Morricone De Palma score. The film didn't do very well either.
I love that one as well, I have to say. I love that. I'd forgotten about that, actually, that I didn't love the film, but the music to Mission to Mars is gorgeous.
There's one scene, I believe, I haven't seen the film for years, where I believe they're on a spaceship and the hull's breached, and there is this kind of repetitive organ arrangement, which again is one of those wildly eccentric Morricone tracks. Apparently, just as many people hated that as they did love it, and it's so odd. Like, no one but Morricone would have thought of that. But in terms of Casualties of War, it's a very, as one would expect from the subject matter, very, very disturbing film. It's sort of one of the most disturbing and uncomfortable, hard to watch war films ever. I chose this because I saw Morricone live in December 2006 at what was then the Hammersmith Apollo. It's one of the most profound, transcendent musical experiences that I've ever been to. I love seeing live music. There is nothing quite like seeing an orchestra playing live, let alone one that is being personally conducted by Ennio Morricone himself. It's incredibly
amazing.
Yeah, astonishing experience. And he played this, and I don't think I'd heard it before then. And I came away thinking, wow, what was that? Now, I looked in the programme to see what it was. And the sense of anguished, tormented sadness and sorrow in the main theme is really quite remarkable, because it's not just an elegy for what happened to Vietnam. It's an elegy for the corruption that obviously happened to all the soldiers, the fact, the dehumanising effects of war. That is quite clearly what Morricone is feeding off. And he works hand in hand with De Palma to deliver that. And the main theme is just one of the most moving bits of music that he ever came up with. And it is an elegy to the tragedy of Vietnam, the tragedy felt by both, the inhabitants of Vietnam itself, and also the American soldiers. The fact they were sent in there and they had their humanity systematically wiped out of them. And the way that Morricone, it's a very dark score. Maybe not one of his most accessible scores, the way that main theme is deconstructed and threaded. You get bits of it throughout the remainder of the score. You get the concert presentation of it, which is the most famous bit, but then you get bits of it, a tease throughout the remainder of the score to depict the horror of what is going on and the tragedy of what's going on. I mean, Morricone was very often, he was a kind of themes and variations composer. What I mean by that is certain film scores have a multitude of themes in them. Certain other film scores have one theme that is then kind of presented in full and then broken down, fragmented, turned inside out. This is very much one of those scores. It's a challenging score because the film is a very, very challenging watch. I mean, the performances by Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn are extraordinary. It's probably might be Brian De Palma's best film, certainly his most socially significant film. And I won't give away the context of the ending, but the final sequence where the main theme comes soaring back in to lead us into the end credits is just kind of like, you're just left reeling at how well the music works in terms of getting beneath the fabric of the visuals and doing what Jerry Goldsmith did, which you don't score the visuals, you score the emotional truth of the characters. And it works magnificently well in this.
Yeah, I want to catch that. I'd not heard of the film, actually. Funnily enough, it wasn't one that was on my radar, so it's definitely made me want to go and watch it now and see the music, listen to the music in context, because it's a fantastic piece. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to doing that. Let's finish though with a return to the good, the bad, and the ugly for what I said at the top is, I think, my favourite piece of Morricone music, and that's the Ecstasy of Gold from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which figures in like the ultimate climax of the film, the three-way Mexican standoff. This kicks it off. It's followed by the triple duel, and then comes to a head in with the trio at the end, which sort of finishes it off. I think at sort of the end, ends the film. I think like this is a fantastic piece of music. I every time I listen to this, I just get so much out of it. And I mean, it's as you say, it's got the vocals by Eddie Delorso as well. One of his most well-known themes, and it's appeared so often. You know, I mean, ever since 1983, Metallica have used it as the introductory music for their concerts. The Ecstasy of Gold, which is cool. It's on several of their albums. It's been used by the Ramones for their concerts since 1991. It's been used by people like Yo-Yo Ma, Jay-Z. It's featured in films like The Rocky Horror Show, The Book of Life. You know, all kinds of things. It's been on The Simpsons. You know, it's everywhere. It's one of those great pieces of music. And I just think it's so rousing and thrilling and hummable and enjoyable outside of the actual brilliance of its position in the film. I think maybe it's not necessarily the most beautiful thing that Morricone's ever done, but I think it's one of the most skillful. And it basically, if somebody said to me, what track would you say to somebody, will I like Ennio Morricone? What track? I would give them the Ecstasy of Gold and say, if you like this and you like film music, then you will love everything else he's done.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I'd say it's easily one of the most beautiful things he'd ever done. It's a really, really genre-defying, pioneering piece of music. Once again, it's up there with the classical staples. It's up there with, you know, you think of Handel, like Zadok the Priest, we mentioned that a couple of weeks ago in reference to the man's King George. It's up there in terms of how famous it is and in terms of its just overall pop culture significance. I mean, you summed it up beautifully there, and the fact that the likes of the Ramones and Metallica are wise enough to recognise its significance, that they use it. It's just I can't think of an example of a film composer, with the possible exception of Hans Zimmer. I can't think of a film composer who has crossed over into that crowd-pleasing, more mainstream area, and I think it's one of the many reasons to like Metallica is that they obviously recognise the quality of the music. I think good for them, frankly. It's brilliant that they recognise the significance of this particular track, and I suppose, I mean, one could say, along with the main theme from The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, this was probably the track that announced Morricone's arrival in Hollywood. He had done the two prior Western scores, But this piece of music, The Ecstasy of Gold, just takes it to the next level. I don't think anyone had heard music like this before. Certainly no one here had heard music like this before in a Western. Definitely not. It brought that Italian operatic sensibility to a global audience who maybe weren't aware of it or who weren't interested in it. And it found exactly the right context to showcase such an approach. Credit Sergio Leone for this as well. As I've said repeatedly, we've both said it. The success of a film score, a good film score, owes just as much to the director. It owes a lot to the conversation between the director and the composer. Clearly, these two were friends. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were clearly on the same page. And what the music does, what this particular piece of music does, is it takes a very rudimentary scene of Eli Wallach basically running through a graveyard. I mean, there's not a lot going on in the scene. It's the music that makes it, isn't it? It's the music that does it. And as the camera whirls around to visually signify the ecstasy, it's the score that makes you feel it, because on its own terms, the scene as it plays out is quite crude, and in the context of The Good, the Bad and the Ugly, probably quite unremarkable. But the score makes you see more than what you're seeing, if you kind of know what I mean. It's a cliche. It's a God-given gift. It really is. I don't know how anyone can come up with music like this. Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, cinema, after composing this, cinema was never the same again. That's how good Morricone was.
I think you've summed that up brilliantly there, actually. It's a great way to close this off, really. A God-given gift that changed cinema forever for the better and provided some of the most beautiful music ever made. So we can only thank him for everything he gave to the world in terms of music and the legacy that he will leave and the amount of wonderful music that is out there waiting to be listened to, waiting to be discovered by future generations of film music fans and to be loved, hopefully, for the rest of time. So it's amazing.
I mean, what I want to echo what Hans Zimmer himself said. Hans Zimmer did a very moving BBC tribute that people can look up online. Hans Zimmer was hugely influenced by Ennio Morricone. He was a huge fan, and he's done some lovely words. He basically said that with such a legacy of music like this, the artist never really leaves us. The artist is still alive in spirit, because the magnitude of the work is so vast and so profound that although the Morricone is no longer with us in person, he is still with us in spirit. And you know that an artist has reset the boundaries of what's possible when you can say that about someone. You can't say that about many people, but Morricone is definitely one of them.
Yeah. There'll only be a handful of people. I think similar sentiments will be said about John Williams when he passes away eventually. But yeah, you're right. I think, it's very, very few people you can say that about. So, yeah, amazing. And it's been really delightful to listen to many of these tracks and these albums recently, and it won't be the last time we do. And it won't be the last time Morricone appears on this podcast, almost certainly, as we go through and we look back at stuff. So, yeah, it's long may it continue, really. But this wasn't the only one you did this week as well, was it? A tribute. You did one on your other podcast, Frame to Frame. Is that right?
Yeah, with my good friend Andy Williams. Yeah, we talked about Morricone, because every now and then you hear about the death of someone in popular culture and it kind of knocks you back on your heels a little bit, and you think, no, that's not the news I wanted to hear. And it's not often I would do two podcasts on the same person within the course of 1 week, but Morricone was not an ordinary individual. I'm sure I'm speaking for you as well when I say that he imprinted on me from a very, very young age. Even before I got into film music properly, even before I saw him live, even before I had an appreciation of the films that the music appeared in, he is kind of in my mind. His music is in my mind, and yeah, that's what he means to me. He was a towering individual.
Yeah, and I would encourage anyone to go and listen to Frame to Frame, which is also on the We Made This podcast network that we're on, and give that a listen as well, because it's great. But just remember that we'll have a Spotify playlist to go alongside this that we'll put on social media and in the show notes. as well with all these tracks that you can go and listen to. I think all of them are on Spotify this time, which is great. So you can listen to them all in one go, which is lovely. And then we'd encourage you to expand and go listen to many of the albums and things like that around that. And not all of them are completely on Spotify, I think then you've got to go and sort of farm off to YouTube and things like that to find everything. But it's all out there. It will all be out there. So yeah, absolutely go and do that. And I think it'd be well worth your time. But we'll be back next week, I think, for our planned one this week, which was the high school movie score. So it'll be quite upbeat. We've got some fun stuff, haven't we, Sean, for that? A nice mixture of actual music as well as actual like pop music and things like that, as well as classical film stuff. Yeah,
we're shaking up. Let's face it, we need cheering up. we need something. Yeah. we need something upbeat. We need a bit of rock and roll. We need something that's got some rhythm and some funkiness to it. Yeah, looking forward to that one.
It's going to be good. It's going to be different. So yeah, that'll be great. And but yeah, thank you for joining us for this rather sad episode of Between the Notes. But we hope that you've got something from it and it will help you remember the Maestro, Ennio Morricone. But we're part, as I say, of the We Made This podcast network, and it's not all we're talking about this week, so we'll give you a taste of what you might have missed in a moment. But until then, we hope you continue to enjoy the music we've discussed, that you're all staying safe and well, and we will see you next time as we discuss more music of film Between the Notes. Elsewhere on We Made This. We played this.
I had Pokemon Blue back in the day, and I think that was probably one of the very first games that I sort of technically completed. And when I say completed, I don't mean like I definitely did not get an 151 Pokédex or anything like that, but getting to the Elite Four and then doing the end game bits. And to be fair, I remember this as being the very first game that I ever bought an instruction guide for.
Okay, yeah, because they were all the rage, weren't they?
Yeah, the strategy guide. I had one, an unofficial one, that I bought from W.H. Smith's as a kid.
Don't say the C word.
I like memorabilia that has a story to it, that has a relationship to it. I think that's why Funko Pops are so popular, because of the nostalgia factor. I think it's a little tangible bit of something very important in someone's history.
I think Funko Pops are hideous.
I love them.
Of course you do.
I've got a full Back to the Future collection.
Of course you have.
I've got nearly the full A-Team collection apart from the van. And I've got an Andre the Giant that's just a little bit bigger than the other ones, which is lovely.
I mean, I get it, and I like stuff like that when they do that. That is cool.
Shipwrecked and Comatose, a Red Dwarf podcast.
Which one do you think the heroine did?
From the way you've worded it, I would say the former.
Yes, and this is what young women, like teenage girls, are being influenced by, and it's not good.
I really like your newborn daughter. I'm going to marry her in 18 years.
Oh yes.
Which is something that happens in the book as well.
Yeah.
Allegedly.
Oh yes. Yes, it does. Anyway, what's the worst book of all time, boys?
Oh, right, well.
And why is it Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey?
Check out all of these shows and more on the We Made This podcast network. Between the Notes is produced and edited by Tony Black, who hosts alongside Sean Wilson. You can find Tony on Twitter at AJBlackWriter and Sean on Twitter at Seano22. You can find Between the Notes on Twitter at BTW_notes, on iTunes, your podcast app of choice, on Spotify, Stitcher and on Spreaker, where the show is part of the We Made This podcast network. For more podcasts all about TV, film, books, music and popular culture in general, you can find We Made This on Facebook and on Twitter at We Made This Pod. Thanks for listening.